From rocky shores, where goats grazed between olive trees, they ventured, sailors who redrew the map of civilization. Driven by hunger, ambition, and oracles' whispers, Greek colonists planted cities across 3 seas, transforming wilderness into ordered streets and marble temples. First Minoans and Mycenaeans charted bronze routes, then Euboeans seized Italian harbours, Milesians ringed the Black Sea, and Phocians reached distant Marseille. Each new polis carried sacred flame from home, yet answered to no master. Through trade and faith, these scattered settlements wove distant coasts into a single Greek world, a network that would outlast empires and reshape human geography from Sicily to the Hindu Kush. The sea came first. Before the poets, before the alphabet, before men called themselves Greeks, the sea already connected the scattered islands like threads drawn taut between mountains. Bronze gleamed on its surface, shaped into blades, mirrors, and anchors. Along these shining routes sailed the first architects of what would one day become the Hellenic world. They did not yet speak in Homer's tongue, but they carried the same hunger, to cross water, to trade, to build, to endure. Across the southern Aegean rose the Minoans of Crete, whose palaces shone like coral in the sun. Their kings ruled from labyrinthine halls painted with leaping bulls and red lilies, but their real kingdom was the sea. From Knossos, Phaistos, and Zakros, their ships fanned outward, graceful hulls built from cedar and cypress, stitched with flaxen cord, and driven by ranks of oars that beat like heartbeats. They sailed to the Cyclades, to Rhodes, to the Levant, exchanging oil, wool, and metalwork for ivory, tin, and the blue stone lapis that carried the scent of the East. To them, distance was not danger. It was wealth waiting to be ferried home. Farther north, the mainland highlands brooded under snow and wind. There the Mycenaean warlords learned from the islanders. They took the Minoan script and carved it into their own tablets. They built citadels crowned with lions, their gates vast enough for kings and their chariots. Bronze flowed into their hands through routes first opened by the Cretans, but the mainlanders added something new, the appetite for conquest. Where the Minoans had ruled by trade and ritual, the Mycenaeans ruled by sword and tribute. In the harbours of Argos, Pylos, and Mycenae itself, their ships waited, heavier and sharper, bearing soldiers as well as goods. Beyond these harbours, the sea thickened with rumour. Sailors spoke of the land of copper, Cyprus, where bronze was born. They spoke of Anatolia's gold and silver, and the harbours of Ugarit and Byblos, where every language could be heard. By the middle of the 2nd millennium, Aegean ships were no longer strangers there. They left behind painted jars and etched blades, proof of a world knitted together not by empires, but by exchange. A cup found in a Levantine palace bore spirals that matched the frescoes of Knossos. A Mycenaean sword turned up in a Syrian tomb. Cypriot copper found its way into the storerooms of Crete. The sea had become a web, and the Aegean its glittering centre. These were not colonies. Not yet. They were stations, the palatial world's version of outposts, where merchants and envoys lived under the shadow of a foreign king, but dined on familiar grain and oil. There was no claim of independence, no city founding with sacred fire carried from home. The men who stayed there were servants of a palace economy that measured the world in ledgers, not laws. But they built something nonetheless, the habit of venturing outward, of planting a foothold on distant shores and calling it an extension of home. In the harbours of Cyprus, Mycenaean merchants learned how to speak to strangers and how to keep the peace with men whose gods were not their own. In the markets of the Levant, They bartered with Phoenician traders long before the name Phoenician was known. On the Anatolian coast, they met the Luwians, whose cities guarded the passes into the highlands. To the west, on the Italian and Sicilian shores, they found the glimmer of obsidian traded since Neolithic times. Slowly, their journeys mapped a world that stretched from Egypt's delta to the heel of Italy. When later Greeks spoke of the known sea, they were naming an inheritance older than memory. Yet beneath this web of exchange, the palatial world trembled. Bronze was a gift and a curse. It demanded tin, rare and distant, drawn from as far as Iberia or the Black Sea. The search for it drove ships ever farther and bound the kingdoms to fragile roots. When storms came or wars closed the passes, the flow of metal stopped, and with it the power of kings. Around 1450 BC, the palaces of Crete burned. Earthquakes may have cracked their walls, or invaders from the mainland may have landed on their beaches. The truth has sunk beneath centuries of dust. What is certain is that the Minoan fleet ceased to rule the Aegean, and Mycenae took its place. On Crete, new rulers stamped their tablets not with the old Minoan signs, but with their own. The age of the sea kings ended, and the age of the warrior lords began. The Mycenaeans expanded their reach with urgency, as if sensing time running short. They fortified their citadels and sent out more ships. Their craftsmen made weapons of elegance and terror, blades of gold inlaid with lions, boars, and spirals of death. They traded not just for wealth, but for prestige. In every alliance, in every gift exchange, lay the whisper of power. A silver crater from Egypt, a necklace from Cyprus, an ivory inlay from Syria, all tokens of a world where diplomacy and desire were measured in metal and beauty. But the palaces that once gleamed with stored grain and bronze bars were also cages. Their economies depended on central storage and distribution, on scribes and accountants, on steady harvests and safe seas. When those failed, through drought, piracy, or invasion, the entire system shuddered. Around 1200 BC, the tremor became collapse. Ships no longer returned. Trade routes went dark. One by one, the citadels fell. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos. Fire ate the palaces, and the scribes who had counted the world's wealth left no more tablets. The age that had defined the Aegean for 8 centuries came to its end. Still, not all was lost. In the ruins of their world, survivors clung to what mattered most. The sea. Fishing boats became lifelines, and traders turned smugglers and storytellers. Bronze gave way to iron, palaces to villages, but the habit of voyaging endured. On the island of Lefkandi, long after the fall, a great burial house rose. A chieftain laid to rest with horses and treasure, his people still remembering how to honor their dead with splendor. The spark had not gone out, it had only dimmed. When later, Greeks built their first true colonies, when they kindled sacred fires from the old hearths and sailed west, they were repeating patterns older than any polis. The Minoans had taught them to navigate, the Mycenaeans to conquer, the Bronze Age to survive collapse by turning outward. From these fragments, the colonizing instinct was born, not as a doctrine, but as a memory of movement. The Aegean had taught its children that to live was to voyage, and to voyage was to endure. The first age of the sea had ended, but its echo remained. In that echo lay the blueprint for all that followed, the ports of Sicily, the harbours of Asia Minor, the marble grids of Alexandria. Every Greek sailor who later left his homeland carried, without knowing it, the ghost of a Mycenaean helmsman and the shadow of a Minoan trader. The tide that had once lapped at Naxos and Mycenae would in time reach every shore of the known world. Once bright with the shimmer of bronze, the world fell silent. Where palaces had hummed with scribes and incense, weeds split the flagstones. Smoke rose over Mycenae, over Tiryns, over the citadel of Pylos, where the last tablets were baked hard by fire. Lists of chariots, shields, and desperate offerings to gods who no longer answered. It was not one disaster, but many, converging like storms. Earthquakes, droughts, foreign raids, rebellion within. The great kingdoms of the Aegean shattered, their networks broken, their storehouses empty. For the first time in centuries, the sea belonged to no one. Across the shattered coastline, survivors fled. Peasants, craftsmen, soldiers without masters gathered their families and took to the mountains or the islands. The old order of kings and palaces gave way to small clusters of villages clinging to arable land or hidden coves. Bronze, the metal that had bound the world together, grew scarce. Tin roots vanished, smiths turned to iron, and with new metal came new ways of fighting. The age of princes in chariots ended. The age of warriors on foot began. In the northern Aegean, dark sails appeared. Strangers who called themselves Dorians. Their dialect was rough, their ways harsh, their weapons iron. They came down through the passes and over the isthmus, seizing the fertile plains of the Peloponnese. Old dynasties fell. The kings of Mycenae were driven out or slain, and new settlements rose on the ruins. Sparta, Argos, Corinth, names that would one day dominate Greece, were born in this aftermath, shaped by conquest and survival. The Dorians brought with them not just arms, but an ethos, discipline, austerity, the belief that a city must be a camp forever ready for war. Others did not conquer, they fled. From the highlands of Achaea and Thessaly, from Attica and Euboea, refugees streamed eastward across the Aegean, following routes once traced by Mycenaean merchants. They landed on the Anatolian coast, finding familiar coves where ruins of old stations still clung to the rocks. There they built anew, Ephesus, Miletus, Priene, and the scattered towns of Ionia. In these settlements, the sea became mother again, providing what the land could not. The exiles brought their gods and songs, but also their memories of palatial order, the sense that a people could be organized, disciplined, governed by law even far from home. Without the palaces, writing vanished. Linear B, the script of kings, fell into oblivion. For centuries, the Greeks would be a people without letters, speaking their history aloud around hearths and in courtyards. But they did not forget. In the long nights after harvest, elders told tales of heroes who had fought beyond the wine-dark sea, stories that would one day become the Iliad and Odyssey. Out of loss grew myth, and out of myth, the idea of return. They called it the return of the Heraclids. According to legend, the Dorian invaders were the descendants of Heracles, reclaiming lands once promised to their ancestor. The story justified conquest, turning violence into destiny. In another corner of the Aegean, the Ionian migration was remembered as a journey of renewal. Noble families escaping ruin to found cities under brighter skies. Every tribe recast its displacement as divine purpose. Out of necessity, they made migration sacred. In the barren years, mobility became survival. Mariners from Euboea and the Cyclades learned to live entirely by the sea, trading fish, salt, and handmade pottery, where once they had sold bronze and gold. Small boats darted between islands, carrying not goods alone, but news, marriages, alliances. The Aegean became a chain of floating villages, each clinging to the next by kinship and barter. Those who could not master the water perished or vanished inland. Across the straits, on Cyprus and the coast of Asia Minor, the displaced Mycenaeans mingled with local peoples, Luwians, Carians, and early Phoenicians. Out of that mingling came a hybrid culture, Greek in speech, Eastern in luxury. They traded with Egypt, where the new kingdom itself was faltering, and with the Levant, where new city-states rose amid the ruins of older empires. The old bronze roots revived in miniature, patchwork and fragile, sustained by necessity rather than grandeur. The Aegean, once a stage of empires, became again a frontier. In the west, meanwhile, faint rumours spoke of wanderers settling new shores, men from the islands of the Aegean, founding hamlets on the coasts of Italy and Sicily, where the soil was generous and the rivers unguarded. Archaeologists would one day call them Proto-Greeks, but in their own time they were only survivors chasing arable ground. They took what they could: the art of shipbuilding, the habit of trade, the resilience of exile. Without meaning to, they began the slow westward drift that would define Greek history for centuries. Out of devastation came simplicity. The grand murals and gilded vessels of the Bronze Age disappeared. In their place appeared hand-painted pottery, circles, spirals, horses. Villages rebuilt themselves around a single hearth, where all shared food and fire. Leadership returned to its primal form. The strongest, the most eloquent, the man who could command in war and speak in peace. This was not yet democracy, but it was the soil from which democracy would grow, a world where power was personal, not bureaucratic. Even in this darkness, faith endured. Shrines were raised on mountain peaks and promontories where temples would later stand. On the hill above Mycenae's ruins, worshippers gathered around an ancient stone altar, pouring oil and grain as their ancestors had done. They no longer remembered the names of the gods exactly as before, but they remembered their gestures, their voices in the wind. From the fragments of the old religion, the Olympian pantheon began to take shape, a faith both local and shared, binding scattered peoples through common rites. As generations passed, the Aegean grew restless again. The sons of refugees became sailors. The daughters of farmers married into new tribes. Iron sharpened, ploughs deepened, trade crept back into the harbours. What had been survival turned to ambition. Ships once used for fishing began to carry cargoes. Amphorae filled with oil, ingots of copper, painted cups. The men who rowed them no longer called themselves exiles. They were traders, explorers, pioneers. Out of hardship, a new identity was forming. Restless, curious, unafraid to leave home. By the dawn of the 10th century, BC, Greece had no kings, no empire, no written record, but it had recovered its heartbeat. Across the islands, hilltop settlements sent their young men abroad to seek fortune and knowledge. Euboea, long poor and peripheral, emerged as a center of this new energy. Its sailors knew the coasts better than any. Its craftsmen forged iron and shaped pottery for export. The first stirrings of a seaborne revival began there, quiet but unstoppable. When later poets would sing of heroes seeking a new land, they were echoing these centuries of wandering. Colonization was not an invention of the rich. It was the perfected instinct of the dispossessed. The collapse had burned away the old certainties, but left behind the one lesson every survivor understood. The world could be remade elsewhere. Soon, from the shores of Euboea, sails would rise once more. Lefkandi's graves would yield not only gold, but ambition. The Aegean, restless and eternal, would call its people outward again, to Cyprus, to Italy, to the edge of the known sea. Out of ruin, the Greeks had learned to move. Now they would learn to found. For centuries, the waves had washed over the wreckage of vanished kingdoms, their bronze blades rusting beneath silt. Yet on certain shores, new smoke began to rise. Thin spirals from hearths that had never known a palace. Greece was stirring again. Among the islands, none awakened more vividly than Euboea. Long, narrow, folded between mountain and sea, it had survived the dark centuries by turning seaward. Its people, farmers, herders, fishermen, had learned to live by the tide. When the harvest failed, they traded. When storms broke their fields, they built boats. In time, these habits hardened into instinct. What had once been desperation became daring. Along the Lelantine plain, two towns came to dominate the island, Eretria and Chalcis. Between them stretched fertile ground and tension. Each sought to master the narrow straits, the gateways to new wealth. Yet rivalry bred vigor. While others in Greece still lived inward, these cities looked outward. Shipwrights lined their beaches, fitting iron nails into pine hulls. The vessels they launched were light, fast, and hungry for distance. Far from royal courts, a new elite arose, chieftains whose power came not from bureaucrats or scribes, but from charisma, wealth, and success abroad. They buried themselves not in tablets, but in grandeur. At Lefkandi, a chieftain's tomb revealed horses laid beside their master, weapons of iron and gold, and a woman crowned in amber and electrum. It was not a palace, yet it spoke with the confidence of one. Such burials announced that hierarchy had returned, not by decree, but by display. Iron changed everything. It was common where bronze had been rare, and its forging no longer depended on distant tin roots. Local smiths became magicians, turning black ore into silver-edged blades. With stronger weapons came secure fields, and with security came surplus. Trade returned first in whispers, then in fleets. Potters painted geometric spirals on amphorae destined for Crete, Cyprus, and the Levant. Slowly, Greece began to speak again with the wider world. Amid this renewal, a new figure emerged, the oikists, the founder. He was neither king nor priest, but both leader and symbol. In every village dreaming of expansion, talk began of finding a new shore. An assembly would choose its oikistes, a man of judgment, strength, and luck, to lead the venture. Before he sailed, he sought divine counsel. Pilgrims trudged to Delphi, where the Pythia, breathing vapors of laurel and earth, would utter Apollo's verdict. Some were told where to go, others only that they would prosper if they dared. These consultations were half prayer, half reconnaissance, for Delphi's fame had made it a clearinghouse of distant rumor. The chosen leader returned home, sanctified by Apollo's word. He presided over rituals that blended piety and pragmatism. In the Prytaneum, the hearth of the city, sacred fire was taken from Hestia's altar, placed in a bronze brazier, and carried aboard the lead ship. From that flame, the colony's new hearth would be kindled, a symbolic transfusion of life. The people wept and cheered as the ships vanished into the horizon, their sails bright against the morning light. These expeditions were small, perhaps a few hundred souls, but each was heavy with hope. The early ventures of the Euboeans were exploratory, more like extended trading missions than full settlements, yet their reach astonished their neighbors. They appeared on the shores of Cyprus and the coasts of Anatolia, where the descendants of the old Mycenaean migrants still lived. They bartered for copper and timber, for grain and wine, for exotic luxuries to dazzle their patrons at home. The pottery found in foreign tombs tells their story. Vases from Lefkandi and Syrian graves, Chalcidian jars in Phoenician ports. Wherever a safe anchorage existed, Euboean traders left a trace of home. Not all the rewards were material. In their dealings abroad, these sailors encountered the alphabet, simple signs used by Phoenician merchants to tally goods. The Greeks borrowed it, reshaped its sounds, and in doing so, reclaimed writing from oblivion. What the palatial world had lost, the seafaring world restored. Now words could travel as safely as ships. Names, treaties, dedications, all could endure beyond memory. This quiet revolution would arm the coming generations with a tool more enduring than bronze. Within Euboea itself, prosperity bred complexity. Eretria and Chalcis expanded their fields, drained marshes, built temples, and quarreled over boundaries. The Lelantine War, half myth and half memory, erupted between them. A conflict as much about honor as soil. Though neither side truly triumphed, the struggle tested their capacity for alliance and organization. Out of these contests arose the rudiments of what would later be called the polis, a community bound not just by blood, but by laws, oaths, and shared defense. Beyond Euboea, the mainland joined the awakening. In Attica, small clans united under a single political identity. In Corinth, craftsmen turned their hands to trade. In the north, Thessaly's pastures filled again with horses. Everywhere, stone replaced timber, order replaced drift. The memory of collapse still haunted the people, yet it drove them toward cohesion. The gods, too, seemed to demand permanence. Shrines became temples. Open-air offerings became columns and roofs. Faith was no longer local alone. It was architectural, civic, enduring. In these same years, art began to remember the human form. Potters painted processions and warriors, chariots and feasts, scenes of continuity with the heroic past. The living looked upon their vessels and saw the ghosts of Mycenae. This rediscovery of form was more than aesthetic. It was a reclamation of identity. The Greeks were learning again to tell their story not as fragments, but as lineage. Meanwhile, across the Aegean, their exploratory outposts were growing bolder. On Cyprus, a few Euboean merchants stayed through the winter, building warehouses of mud brick and reed. On the Anatolian coast, in the shadow of old Mycenaean settlements, new communities took shape, ruled not by local kings, but by councils of settlers. Their language and customs marked them as outsiders, yet their adaptability earned them tolerance. Step by step, they were practicing colonization before the word existed. What set this revival apart was its spirit. The old palaces had sought control. The new voyagers sought opportunity. Their courage lay not in command, but in risk. They understood that the sea could destroy as easily as enrich, yet they went anyway. Each voyage was a negotiation with fate, each safe landing a small miracle. Out of such fragile undertakings grew the Greek genius for persistence, the belief that fortune favored the bold, and that exile could be turned into creation. By the early 8th century, the revival was complete. The Aegean no longer mourned its fallen citadels. It hummed with ambition. Traders from Euboea and Corinth sailed westward now, past the Cyclades and Crete, toward lands unknown to their ancestors. Their holds carried not tribute, but gifts, olive oil, pottery, iron blades, and their minds carried the memory of their fathers' migrations. To them, the sea was not exile, but inheritance. In time, those wanderers of the sea would pass beyond Greece's sight, reaching Italy's shores and the smoking isles beyond, where they would give the Greek world its first life abroad. At the far end of the Aegean imagination lay a sea of rumour. Sailors spoke of a coast beyond the wine-dark horizon, where copper ran in the hills, and rivers wound through dark volcanic soil. Some called it Italia, others simply the Western Land. For generations, these tales had drifted eastward, like the scent of resin from a distant fire. Now, at last, the Euboeans meant to find it. From the island of Euboea, chiefly from Chalcis and Eretria, a fleet of narrow ships slipped through the straits, their prows carved with horse heads, their holds filled with jars of oil and wine. They carried with them sacred flame from Hestia's hearth, bronze tools, and the courage of exile's descendants. At their head sailed an oikists chosen by lot and omen, a man whose name would be forgotten, though his voyage would change the shape of the Greek world. The gods were invoked, the winds trusted. Westward they went. After days on open water, the travellers reached the Bay of Naples, where an island smoked upon the sea. Its slopes shimmered with obsidian, its springs steamed with sulphur. Its name whispered of monkeys, Pithekoussai. To the Greeks, it was not the end of the world, but its rebirth, a volcanic rock halfway between myth and opportunity. Here, around 770 BC, they built their first foothold. They did not come as conquerors. The Euboeans found the island already visited by traders from the Etruscan mainland and the Phoenician coast. Rather than drive them out, they joined them. Pithekoussai became a mingled marketplace, a polyglot emporium, not a polis. The Greeks brought pottery and olive oil. The Etruscans offered metalwork. The Phoenicians, glass and dyes. Fires burned day and night on the beach as furnaces smelted copper and iron, feeding an economy born of coexistence. In its crowded workshops, one could hear a dozen tongues and smell bronze, pitch, and wine mingling in the same air. The settlement sprawled without walls, its huts rising from the dark soil like scattered embers. Yet it thrived. Graves cut into the slopes reveal amphorae painted in the geometric style of Euboea, cups inscribed with Greek letters, the earliest west of the Aegean. One of them, small and unassuming, would outlive its maker, the cup of Nestor, etched with a playful boast that whoever drank from it would be seized by desire for the fair-crowned Aphrodite. It was a jest, perhaps, but also a milestone. The alphabet that had travelled from Phoenicia through Euboea had now crossed to Italy. Writing itself had gone west. Beneath the surface of trade ran something deeper, the rediscovery of ambition. In the forges of Pithekoussai, Greek smiths learned new alloys from Etruscan masters. In its taverns, they heard rumours of fertile plains on the mainland. The island was a stepping stone, never a home. Its people began to look across the bay toward the dark ridge of Campania, where rivers gleamed through volcanic ash. There, they were told, lay open ground enough for a true city. The founding of Cumae followed within a generation. Around 750 BC, settlers from Pithekoussai and Euboea crossed to the mainland and established themselves on a defensible hill above the coast. Here, among oak forests and black soil, they built houses of stone and timber, surrounded by a wall and crowned with an acropolis. Cumae was not a station, but a polis, a living city. For the first time since the fall of Mycenae, Greeks had planted an independent community beyond their homeland. Founding a city demanded ritual as much as courage. Before they sailed, the colonists had drawn lots for land, invoking Zeus and Apollo to ensure fairness. Upon landing, they sacrificed a bull and lit their new hearth with flame carried from Euboea, symbolizing the unbroken chain of life from mother city to daughter. They poured libations to the gods of the land, calling upon the spirits of the soil to accept them. In time, even local Italic deities were honored beside the Olympians. a gesture of diplomacy as much as devotion. The gods of the newcomers and the natives began, slowly, to share altars. The newcomers traded eagerly with their neighbors. Iron and wine went north to the Etruscans, who sent back bronze and fine mirrors. Olive oil flowed south toward the Greek sailors plying the Sicilian straits. The sea that had once divided cultures now bound them together. Cumae's harbour filled with ships not only from Euboea, but from Corinth, Rhodes, and even the Levant. From these docks, Greek architecture and language began to seep inland, carried by artisans and merchants. The Hellenic world was expanding not by empire, but by contagion. At home, the news of prosperity spread quickly. The success of Cumae transformed Western colonization from a gamble into a policy. Cities that had once watched the Euboeans with envy now prepared their own fleets. The mainland's younger sons, long denied inheritance, saw in Italy a promise of renewal. Soon, new expeditions set sail from Corinth, Megara, and Rhodes, each seeking its own share of the western horizon. In Italy itself, the Greeks became both settlers and diplomats. The Etruscans were powerful, their cities rich in iron, and guarded by gods older than Zeus. Rather than fight, the Greeks bargained, offering their craft and their ships in exchange for peace. Marriage alliances sealed the deals, markets opened. Cumae grew into a bridge between worlds. Greek in speech, Italic in temperament, its rulers skilled at balancing east and west. Here too, mythology took root. Legend held that the Sibyl of Cumae, possessed by Apollo, uttered prophecies from a cave near the city gates. Even Rome, centuries later, would claim her as its oracle. The success of Cumae altered the Greeks' perception of the West. What had once seemed a frontier became a mirror. They discovered that their culture could flourish in foreign soil without losing its shape. Colonization was no longer a sign of desperation, but a form of creation, a way to extend Greece without dissolving it. Every new settlement became a second homeland, linked to the first by ritual fire, memory, and trade. Meanwhile, the mother cities of Euboea basked in reflected glory. Chalcis and Eretria enriched themselves through commerce with their western offspring, sending ships laden with amphorae, grain, and iron tools. Yet their rivalry persisted, the old Lelantine enmity rekindled by jealousy of Cumae's fortune. In their competition lay a paradox that would define Greek expansion: cooperation abroad, contention at home. By the close of the 8th century, the Euboean pioneers had proved what no one had dared to believe, that a Greek city could stand, thrive, and rule beyond the Aegean. From their example, others would follow. Corinthians to Sicily, Megarians to the western coast, islanders from Naxos and Thera to new worlds across the sea. The chain of foundations would lengthen year by year, each link hammered from ambition and necessity. The western horizon no longer looked distant. It glittered now with possibility, with harbours waiting for names and hills waiting for temples. The Greeks had crossed the threshold from wanderers to founders. Their world, once confined to the Aegean, had acquired a second heart. The island lay ahead, like a promise drawn from the sea. From a distance, Sicily shimmered, its coasts white with salt flats, its interior veiled in blue haze, and at its heart the volcano Etna, breathing slowly like a god asleep. To the Greeks who first sighted it, this was not merely land. It was horizon incarnate, a continent of grain and stone rising out of mist. Here, the Western world truly began. The first to land were the men of Naxos, sailing from Chalcis and Naxos in the Aegean. They came around 734 BC. led by their oikistes Theocles, a name that meant glory of the gods. His glory would indeed be divine, though earned by courage rather than miracle. The expedition had been blessed at Delphi, and the Pythia, in a riddle of laurel smoke, had promised a fertile island guarded by fire. They found it here, black volcanic soil rich beyond imagining, fields watered by rivers, and bays that held their ships like open hands. On a small headland, they built altars to Apollo and Artemis, and raised a stockade of stone and timber. Naxos, the first Greek city in Sicily, had been born. Not far behind came another fleet from Corinth, commanded by Archias, a man whose ambition outstripped the horizon itself. The tale goes that Archias, fleeing blood guilt at home, sought a new beginning across the Ionian Sea. His ships reached Sicily soon after Theocles had planted his altars. Where Naxos lay upon the northeast coast, Archias steered farther south and found a broad harbour, deep and defensible, bordered by a river and a fertile plain. He called it Syracuse after the nearby marsh of Syraca. There, in 734 BC, he set his men to work, clearing ground, carving mooring stones, laying out streets that would one day echo with the footsteps of tyrants and philosophers alike. Syracuse would outgrow its mother city in every way, but on that first day, it was no more than a cluster of huts and hopes. Archias followed every sacred rite. He lit his hearth with fire brought from Corinth, divided land by lot, and sacrificed to Apollo, patron of colonists. His companions swore oaths of loyalty, each man bound not by ancestry, but by shared risk. The colony thus founded was free of its metropolis in law, but tied by devotion. Archias ruled not as a tyrant, but as a founder, a father whose authority was sanctified by the gods. When he died, his tomb would stand in the agora, and future Syracusans would honor him with games and offerings, as all Greeks honored their oikists. Meanwhile, along the southeastern shore, another expedition was making landfall. The settlers of Megara had followed the coast of Greece, rounded the Peloponnesian headlands, and crossed into the Western Sea. Their leader was Lamis, who sought fortune after years of famine at home. His fleet touched at several Sicilian harbours before coming upon a plain rich in water and grain, near the land of the Sicile tribes. There, between the hills and the sea, they founded Megara Hyblaea, named for their city and for the local king Hyblon, who had granted them the ground. Unlike many encounters between Greek and native, this one began in peace. Hyblon saw in the newcomers a chance for alliance, and the Greeks, weary of wandering, accepted his gift. In return, they raised temples and markets that soon drew trade from every coast. Thus, within a single generation, 3 Greek cities had rooted themselves in Sicily's soil. They were not outposts like Pithekoussai, but self-sufficient states. Farmers, artisans, soldiers, and sailors bound by civic law. Their harbours filled with ships from Corinth, Euboea, and Crete. The old islands of the Aegean now sent their sons westward to harvest grain instead of olives, to quarry marble instead of obsidian. Sicily became the new Aegean, its capes echoing with the dialects of distant homelands. The Greeks called their new neighbours Sicels, Sicans, and Elymians, peoples as old as the island's mountains. At first, relations were uncertain. Skirmishes at the edges, truces sealed by marriage or trade. The natives traded livestock and hides for pottery and weapons. The Greeks taught them to build in stone and to worship in sanctuaries rather than caves. In time, Greek words mingled with native tongues, and the line between colonist and local blurred. Some Sicels took Greek names. Some Greeks adopted Sicel gods. Colonization here was not conquest alone. It was absorption. a weaving of identities around shared necessity. Each new city drew strength from the land itself. The plains around Syracuse produced grain so abundant that it fed not only its own people, but merchants as far away as Corinth. The rivers near Megara Hyblaea turned millstones and watered vineyards. Naxos, though smaller, became sacred as the first of its kind. Pilgrims came to its altar of Apollo to offer thanks before founding new cities of their own. From these beginnings spread a chain of settlements, Leontini, Catani, and Akragas, each born of another's surplus and ambition. To map Sicily then was to map the Greek imagination expanding westward, the coastline filled with harbours and walls, the interior still Sicile and untamed, beckoned with mystery. Every ridge promised another foundation. Roads began to trace lines between cities, and the island grew webbed with commerce. Greek artisans imported marble and bronze. Native miners brought ore from the hills. On festival days, processions wound through streets that still smelled of foreign earth, but rang with familiar hymns. The Aegean was reborn in miniature, an echo turned solid. Behind the prosperity lurked rivalry. The settlers were Greeks, and Greeks quarreled as easily as they prayed. Disputes flared over borders, alliances, trade routes. Yet their conflicts were creative as much as destructive. In striving against one another, they refined their institutions, councils, assemblies, armies. Even war became a forge. Through friction, the scattered polis of Sicily hardened into a constellation, each bright enough to be seen from the homeland. To those left behind in Greece, the reports were intoxicating. Fertile fields, rich harvests, cities built in months rather than generations. The poverty of the homeland, its stony terraces and parched valleys, seemed suddenly unbearable. Whole communities began to dream of sailing west. Colonization had ceased to be an experiment. It had become a vocation. The Greek world was learning to multiply itself. By the end of the 8th century, Sicily had ceased to be foreign. The ships that once came timidly now arrived laden with settlers, priests, and poets. Each brought memories of the Aegean and grafted them onto new soil. Temples rose beside Sicil's sanctuaries. Greek coinage jingled beside native ornaments. A new civilization, both Hellenic and Western, began to take shape. Its voice still rough, its promise immense. On an autumn morning, as dawn spilled over the eastern sea, a Corinthian mariner standing on the walls of Syracuse could look back across the Ionian waters and almost see home. Between him and his birthplace stretched a chain of islands, ports, and shrines, a living bridge of language and faith. The Greeks had crossed a frontier not only of geography, but of imagination. Their world was no longer bounded by the Aegean, and beyond Sicily, farther west, still waited more coasts, more rivers, more plains unclaimed by any god or city. The age of founding had only just begun. By the time a century had passed since the first altar was raised at Naxos, Sicily was no longer a frontier. It was a world entire, a glittering web of harbours and plains, of Greek speech mingling with Sicel names, of temples that caught the dawn as if the sun itself were reborn each morning in the west. The island that had once been promise was now possession, and possession demanded order. From this settled abundance emerged new ambition. The sons of settlers looked inland, beyond the familiar harbours, to valleys where rivers flashed like blades between fertile banks. Among them was a band of colonists from Rhodes and Crete, who in 688 BC founded Gela on the southern coast. Their oikists, Antiphemus of Rhodes, chose his site wisely, between two rivers, on ground both defensible and rich. Around their hilltop, they built houses in straight lines, the earliest whisper of the city grid. Gela's walls rose quickly, her fields filled with barley, and her port became the southern hinge of Greek Sicily. From Gela, the colonizing spirit leapt again. Within a generation, her citizens launched daughter foundations of their own, scattering the southern shore with new towns, Akragas, Selinus, and Hymera among them. The Greek instinct to multiply had found its purest form, colonies of colonies, each a seed flowering into others. By the 6th century, the entire coastline glittered with their presence. Traders from Corinth and Athens now spoke of Sicily as a constellation of shining cities, each distinct, each radiating power. The founding of Akragas around 580 BC marked the culmination of this surge. 2 Gelan leaders, Aristonus and Pistolus, guided the expedition inland to a ridge between 2 rivers, the Akragas and the Hypsas. The place commanded both sea and plain, fertile beyond measure and guarded by cliffs. They drew lots for land, burned offerings to Zeus, and laid out streets with geometric precision. From its birth, Akragas seemed touched by grandeur. Its people raised walls that gleamed white under the sun, and temples whose columns rivaled those of the homeland. Akragas, wrote a later poet, dwells in splendor as if she would live forever. Between these cities, trade moved like blood through veins. Grain from the valleys filled the holds of merchant ships bound for Greece and beyond. From Gela came pottery of distinctive red and black. From Syracuse, bronzes, from Selinus, carved stone. The land itself seemed to reward Greek order with harvests that astonished even the farmers of Attica. Where Sicel villages had once grazed goats, fields now rippled with barley, olives, and vines. In the markets, Greek drachmas clinked against native ornaments. Slaves, mercenaries, and artisans changed masters as easily as ships changed course. Still, beneath the wealth, ran tension. The native Cycles, Sicans, and Elymians had not vanished. They had adapted. Some served as allies, some as subjects, others as adversaries. In the highlands, they watched the newcomers with wary eyes. The Greeks, though skilled at diplomacy, never forgot how quickly peace could sour. Each city fortified itself, raising walls and outposts along the passes. To travel from Syracuse to Selinus was to move through a patchwork of rival jurisdictions, each jealous of the other's soil and gods. Still, there were moments of unity, especially when outsiders threatened. To the west loomed Carthage, the great Phoenician power of North Africa, whose merchants coveted the same roots and fields. Between Carthage and the Greeks stretched the island's center, a zone of uneasy contact. There, around 648 BC, the city of Hymera was founded on the northern coast, intended as a bulwark against Punic influence. Its settlers came from Zancle and from Euboea, blending Ionian and Dorian customs. From its acropolis, they could see the distant glow of Phoenician fires across the sea, a warning that the western frontier would never be quiet. As Sicily filled with Greek cities, their ambitions collided. Gela warred with its daughters. Syracuse coveted Megara Hyblaea's ports. Selinus clashed with Carthaginian allies over trade. Yet these rivalries were as creative as they were destructive. Out of conflict arose innovation. Armies of hoplites replaced raiding bands. Coinage standardized exchange. Temples crowned the acropolis with civic pride. The polis, matured in exile, had found its truest expression on Sicilian soil. Among these cities, one rose higher than all. Akragas, fed by the richest plains and ruled by daring men, soon rivaled even Syracuse. Its rulers, known later as tyrants, built monuments that astonished travelers, colossal temples to Olympian Zeus, Hera, and Concordia, terraces where processions wound like rivers of white linen, granaries that could feed an army. To walk through Akragas at its height was to see ambition turned to architecture. Here, colonization ceased to be survival. It became civilization. But greatness carried peril. The very fertility that enriched the Greeks drew enemies to them. Carthage, alarmed by their advance, began to arm. Alliances were struck among native tribes and Punic generals. The island that had once been a patchwork of markets was now a chessboard of empires. Yet the Greeks of Sicily did not shrink. In their pride, they saw themselves as defenders of Hellenism at the edge of the world. Every harvest, every festival, every battle was a reaffirmation that the sea-born race could master even the most alien land. Their pride was not misplaced. When the storm finally broke in the year 480 BC, it came with fire and legend. Hamilcar, the Carthaginian general, landed with a vast host at the western tip of the island, intent on crushing the Greeks once and for all. At Himera, he met the forces of Gelon, tyrant of Syracuse, and Theron of Akragas. On that same week, far to the east, Greek fleets fought the Persians at Salamis. 2 seas, 2 battles, 1 destiny. The armies clashed on the plain under a burning sun. Gelon's cavalry swept through the Carthaginian ranks, while Theron's infantry held the center. By nightfall, the invaders were broken. Hamilcar himself was slain in his tent, burned as he offered sacrifice. The victory was so complete that the Greeks of Sicily believed their gods had mirrored those of the homeland, Apollo shining on both horizons at once. The twin triumphs of Himera and Salamis secured the Greek world from extinction, one defending freedom in the east, the other preserving it in the west. In the aftermath, the Sicilian polis entered their golden age. The victors adorned their temples with spoils, minted coins to commemorate the day, and proclaimed themselves heirs of divine favor. Gelon ruled as savior king. Akragas flowered in art and wealth. Even humble Gela boasted poets and philosophers. For a generation, the Western Greeks lived as if fortune itself had anchored in their harbors. Even so, under the marble and song lay the same restless spirit that had driven their ancestors from the Aegean, the urge to move, to found anew, to expand beyond every limit. Colonization in Sicily had completed its circle, from outposts to cities, from survival to splendor. The island was now a mirror of Greece, more fertile, more violent, more alive. Its soil was rich not only in grain, but in memory, and its people would carry both forward, to Italy, to Africa, to the edge of the known world. South of the rugged spine of Italy, the land opened into a crescent of rivers, plains, and sunlight. To the Greeks who reached it, the soil was almost unnatural in its generosity. Grain that grew without rest, vines heavy with sweetness, and pastures deep enough to drown a horse. Here, between the heel and toe of the Italian boot, a new constellation of cities took shape. The Romans would later call it Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. But to its founders, it was a rebirth, a second homeland drawn in richer colors. The first to strike roots was Sybaris, around 720 BC. Its settlers came from Achaea, bearing the customs of the northern Peloponnese and the confidence of a people seasoned by voyage. They found their paradise at the mouth of the Crathis River, where the sea breeze met inland fertility. Within decades, Sybaris had grown immense. 5 separate districts, each with its own walls, and a population said to rival the cities of Asia Minor. Luxury followed prosperity. Houses gleamed with imported marble. Banquets lasted for days. Silks and perfumes arrived from every horizon. To later generations, Sybarite would mean decadence itself. But in its beginning, the city was admired for its peace. A polis where commerce, not conquest, governed. Yet even peace can sharpen envy. Just down the coast rose Croton, founded around 710 BC by settlers from Achaea and Laconia. If Sybaris embodied wealth, Croton embodied strength. Its citizens trained as athletes and soldiers. Its boys were taught that the body was the measure of virtue. When they competed at Olympia, they won more crowns than any other city of their age. Their fields were vast, their port deep, their pride fierce. The two neighbours, Sybaris, the city of feasts, and Croton, the city of discipline, were bound to clash, though it would take centuries for their rivalry to boil into war. Between them, new towns rose like younger siblings. Metapontum, founded with help from Achaean settlers and the guidance of the Delphic oracle, occupied the richest plain of all. Its grain would one day feed armies. Its coins bore the ear of wheat as emblem and boast. Farther south, at the curve of the Gulf of Taranto, the Spartans carved out Taras, the only colony ever founded directly by Sparta. Its story was born of exile. The Parthenii, children of dishonored unions during the Messenian Wars, had been condemned to banishment. Under their leader, Phalanthus, they sought Apollo's guidance and were told to settle where they saw rain from a clear sky. They puzzled until, one evening, Phalanthus rested his head upon his wife's lap, and her tears fell upon his face. "There," she said, "is your rain." Taking the omen, they sailed west and founded Taras around 706 BC. From the start, Taras was different. Its founders were warriors, disciplined yet restless, inheriting Spartan rigor but freed from Spartan restraint. They laid their city beside a deep harbor, perfect for ships of war, and encircled it with walls that glowed white in the sun. Though small, Taras would become the strongest naval power of the Italian Greeks, its triremes ruling the gulf that bore its name. These four cities, Sybaris, Croton, Metapontum, and Taras, were the pillars of a new Greek dominion on the Western Sea. Together they transformed the coastline into a patchwork of shining polis, linked by trade, kinship, and rivalry. Ships moved endlessly between them, carrying oil, grain, and bronze. Temples rose, theatres opened, and sanctuaries filled with offerings to Apollo and Hera. To sail along this coast was to travel through a living hymn to Greek ambition. The New World also drew new ideas. Around 530 BC, a man arrived in Croton whose influence would reshape the very nature of power: Pythagoras. He came from Samos, a philosopher and mystic exiled from tyranny, bringing with him not only mathematics and music, but a vision of harmony that blended reason with faith. In Croton, his teaching found fertile soil. His followers, men and women alike, formed communities bound by oath and ritual, seeking to purify both body and soul. They believed that the universe moved according to number, and that the just city must mirror the balance of the cosmos. At first, the Pythagoreans were philosophers. Soon they were rulers. Their discipline and solidarity gave them influence over Croton's councils, and even over neighboring cities. They preached moderation against Sybarite excess, order against chaos. Under their sway, Croton defeated its ancient rival Sybaris around 510 BC, destroying the city that had once been a symbol of wealth. The Crathes ran red, its luxury extinguished by ascetic fire. The ruins of Sybaris stood as a monument to the Pythagorean creed. Harmony could triumph, but only through purgation. Yet Pythagoras himself was no mere mathematician cloistered in abstraction. He was a political founder in the older sense. a man who sought to turn philosophy into law. His followers held power across southern Italy, forming what some later writers called the Pythagorean League, a network of disciplined elites governing by consensus and spiritual authority. It was colonization of a new kind, not by the sword, but by the mind. When their influence finally waned amid uprisings and jealousies, they left behind more than burnt houses. They left a template for intellectual order, a fusion of religion, politics, and geometry that would echo through centuries. The Italian Greeks, inspired by these experiments, began to see themselves not as distant outposts, but as equals of the homeland. Their cities minted their own coinage, commissioned poets and physicians, and founded games to rival Olympia. Trade bound them to Sicily, to Etruria, even to Carthage, yet they kept their Hellenic core. In Metapontum, statues of Demeter watched over endless fields of wheat. In Taurus, temples gleamed beside shipyards. The Italiote world was as Greek as Athens, but larger in appetite and more daring in invention. Still, beneath their prosperity, the old rivalries smouldered. Sybaris' destruction was not the last act of fratricide. Croton's power waned. Taurus sought hegemony, but faced constant wars with Italic tribes, the Lucanians, the Messapians, the Bruttians. Greek and native, philosopher and warrior, colonist and exile. The peninsula became a mosaic of struggle and synthesis. Yet through every upheaval, the idea of the polis endured. Each city, no matter how isolated, imagined itself part of the same greater song, a Hellenic chorus echoing across the Western Sea. By the dawn of the 5th century, Magna Graecia had reached its height. The coasts of southern Italy were Greek in speech, law, and faith. Sailors traveling from Sicily to the Adriatic could find a Greek harbor every few days, each marked by the same familiar signs: temples of Apollo, agora filled with olive jars, theatres carved into hillsides. But this brilliance contained the seed of fragility. Wealth drew envy. Luxury softened vigilance. The age of founding had ended. The age of competition was beginning. For now, however, the Italiote world stood resplendent. On quiet evenings, as the sun sank over the Ionian Sea, the colonnades of Taurus and Metapontum blazed like copper, and the sailors of Croton sang hymns to Apollo as their ships returned heavy with grain. From the ashes of Sybaris to the music of Pythagoras, the Greek genius for renewal had once again proven its power. The West was no longer an echo of the East. It was its equal. The Western Greeks had learned to master seas wide as dreams, yet the North still whispered of profit and peril. Beyond the heel of Italy, where the Ionian narrows toward the Adriatic, the waters turned treacherous. Winds met headlong there, and rivers poured silt into hidden bars that could swallow a ship whole. But merchants are born of necessity, and necessity has always been the sternest god. From Corinth and Corcyra, from Taurus and Metapontum, new captains began to sail north. Their eyes were fixed not on conquest, but on commerce. They sought amber from the forests of the north, timber for ships, and slaves from the interior tribes. Commodities as old as the Bronze Age, yet newly valuable in a growing world. The old routes through the Aegean had grown crowded. The wealth of the Adriatic lay untouched. So they sailed where few dared, mapping capes and currents, learning to read the color of the waves for depth and danger. At first, these were seasonal ventures, trading posts rather than colonies, huts of reed and clay built at river mouths. But as the profits grew, so did permanence. The most daring of these founders were the Corinthians, whose genius for organization turned harbors into cities. Around 627 BC, they established Epidamnos, later called Dyrrachion, on the Illyrian shore, facing west toward Italy. The site was perilous but ideal, a deep bay backed by mountains, commanding both land and sea. A century later, the Athenians would fight over it, but for now, it was simply another miracle of endurance. A Greek city raised amid tribes who spoke no Greek at all. Not far away, in 588 BC, Apollonia arose, another Corinthian child, born of trade and piety. Its founders built a temple to Apollo whose cult spread across the Adriatic, uniting settlers and natives under shared reverence. The colonists knew how to blend diplomacy with devotion. They offered gifts to local chiefs, took wives among them, and taught their sons to speak in two tongues. The land gave grain and cattle. The sea gave access to the world beyond. Between Epidamnos and Apollonia ran a corridor that would one day funnel armies, but in that age it carried only caravans of salt, wine, and wool. Through these narrow straits, the Greeks discovered not only new markets, but new challenges. The Illyrian coasts were wild, dense forests, rocky inlets, rivers that shifted course after every flood. Pirates ruled the shallows, slipping out at night to seize ships and vanish into coves. To survive, the Greeks learned new seamanship, lighter hulls for quick pursuit, watchfires along promontories to signal allies. Out of necessity came mastery. The Ionian and Adriatic sailors became legends for their daring, able to navigate by the smell of land or the taste of rain. Wherever they anchored, they built sanctuaries first, walls later. Stone altars rose on headlands to guide travelers, visible beacons for those who would follow. Fishermen and farmers from local tribes brought offerings too, mingling their gods with the Greeks. These were not vast polis, but crossroads of faith and barter, a hybrid world where language was traded as easily as grain. Farther south, the city of Taras turned its gaze outward. With its strong fleet, it dominated the gulf that bore its name, controlling passage between Italy and the Balkans. Tarentine captains charted the waters up to the Iapygian coast, founding small stations that linked the Adriatic to the heart of Magna Graecia. Their ambitions were as much scientific as commercial. They studied currents, wind patterns, and celestial bearings. In these decades, the Greek mastery of navigation became an art form. The sea, once feared as a barrier, had become a kind of measured space, a system to be known, predicted, conquered by intellect. The expansion northward also drew Athens' attention. While the Athenians still nursed their own ambitions in the Aegean, reports of wealth from the Adriatic tempted them. They began sending exploratory missions, small fleets bearing merchants and priests. The Adriatic, once the backwater of the Hellenic world, had become its next horizon. Each settlement in this corridor bore its own character. Epidamnos, pragmatic and merchant-born, bustled with warehouses and shipyards. Apollonia, devoted to Apollo, balanced piety and profit. Its temple gleamed with imported marble, and its oracle rivaled even Delphi in prestige. Smaller enclaves dotted the coastline like pearls. Lissus, Oricum, Pharos, and Issa, each a spark of Greek speech amid Illyrian forests. The Aegean had extended itself not by conquest, but by continuity. A sailor could now leave Corinth and, by island and inlet, never sleep beyond the reach of familiar rites. Yet the sea remained merciless. Every winter, storms swept down from the Alps and tore the harbours apart. Many ships never returned, their cargoes lost with all hands. The Greeks answered with ritual. Before sailing, captains sacrificed black bulls to Poseidon and hung garlands on the prows. When they reached safe haven, they poured libations into the tide, thanking the god for restraint. Each voyage was both act of commerce and act of faith. Each harbour an altar as much as a market. Trade brought not only wealth, but change. In Epidamnos, Greek artisans married Illyrian women, their children bilingual and bold. The interior tribes began adopting Greek pottery, coinage, and customs. The Greeks, in turn, learned the ways of the mountains, their roots, their furs, their iron mines. Out of exchange grew a kind of frontier civilization, neither wholly Hellenic nor wholly barbarian. The Adriatic was becoming what the Aegean had once been, a meeting ground where identity itself was fluid. In time, these northern colonies would feed the ambitions of empires. Their grain and timber would supply the fleets of Corinth and later of Athens. Their ports would serve as staging grounds for armies and merchants alike. But in the late 7th and 6th centuries, they remained raw and hopeful, outposts of daring at the rim of the known sea. Each voyage that reached them proved anew that the Greek world was not a place, but a practice, a rhythm of departure and return. As the sun set over the Ionian waters, a sailor from Taurus might stand at his helm and see the coast of Epirus fading to shadow. Behind him lay the crowded brilliance of Magna Graecia. Ahead stretched the uncertain north. Between them rolled the sea that bound all Greeks, however far they roamed. In that twilight shimmer, the Adriatic no longer seemed distant. It was the next chapter in a story that had no end. Between Europe and Asia stretched a strait so narrow that an archer could shoot an arrow from one shore to the other. The Bosporus, the Cow's Crossing, as legend named it after Eo's wandering, was more than a passage. It was a threshold between worlds, the Aegean and the Black Sea, the known and the unknown, the Greek and the barbarian. Whoever commanded it held the pulse of trade between continents. For centuries it had been watched from afar, a place of rumour and risk. By the late 7th century BC, the Greeks decided it must be theirs. The first to dare were the Megarians, merchants of a small city wedged between Corinth and Athens, but rich in nerve. They had already proven themselves founders, having seeded colonies along the western coast of Asia Minor. Around 685 BC, guided by oracles and ambition, they sent ships through the Hellespont and up to the strait's mouth. There they established Chalcedon on the Asian shore, a defensible ridge with good anchorage and a fertile hinterland. Its settlers believed they had found perfection, but time would reveal otherwise. For 15 years, Chalcedon prospered modestly, its markets filled with grain and fish from the Propontis. Its walls bristled against Thracian raids, yet across the water lay a promontory steeped in mists and promise. The land there faced both seas, commanding every current that flowed between them. Local fishermen spoke of its richness, its springs of sweet water, its endless view. When a later generation of Megarians sailed across to inspect it, they understood their ancestors' folly. The poet Herodotus would say the first settlers of Chalcedon had been blind, for they had looked upon Byzantium and not seen paradise. So, in 657 BC, the Megarians tried again. Their new expedition, led by Byzas, son of the nymph Keroessa, landed upon the European shore and founded Byzantium. The omens were good. A dolphin followed their ships. The winds held steady. The oracle at Delphi had spoken of prosperity where the blind dwell opposite. They raised altars to Apollo and Poseidon, built a stone wall around the promontory, and laid out streets that descended to the sea. In that moment, a city was born, whose name would echo through ages. Byzantium grew swiftly. Its position made it the hinge of empires long before empires existed. From the north came grain and timber along the Euxine Sea. From the south, goods from the Aegean and beyond. Every ship that passed paid toll. Every cargo that crossed was weighed and taxed. In its markets, Greek merchants haggled beside Thracian herdsmen and Scythian traders draped in fur. The air smelled of tar, wheat, and salt. Wealth filled its storehouses. Arrogance filled its citizens. The Megarians, though small in number, understood the necessity of diplomacy. They struck agreements with the Thracians to the west and the Bithynians across the water, trading silver and wine for peace. Many took local wives, and the children of those unions became interpreters and traders, fluent in both tongues. Where other colonies survived by spear and wall, Byzantium thrived by shrewdness. It was less a fortress than a funnel, drawing the riches of the north through its narrow gate. While Byzantium rose, the wider northern Aegean awakened to the same impulse. The peninsula of Chalcidice, stretching into the sea like a trident, was dotted with settlements founded by Euboeans, Corinthians, and Megarians alike. They came for timber and metal, for fish and trade routes, and found themselves in constant quarrel with the native Thracians. Yet out of this contest grew resilience. Cities such as Olynthus, Torone, and Mende took root on its fingers of land, each with harbours deep enough for fleets and hills rich in ore. From these outposts came iron for spears, shipmasts for navies, and slaves for the markets of the south. The Chalcidic coast became a forge of the Greek world's ambitions. The northern colonies differed from their western cousins. Where Sicily and Italy offered abundance, the lands around the straits offered endurance. Winters were harsher, neighbours fiercer. Greek settlers learned to fight as well as trade. They built strongholds rather than open towns, ringed with ditches and walls. At night, wolves howled beyond the fires. By day, traders haggled under the same sky. Life was precarious, but profit was certain. The timber of Thrace built Athenian ships. Its gold gilded Ionian temples. Even the fish of the Bosporus, fat and silver, became legend, sustaining both colonists and fleets. Through these struggles, the Greeks transformed danger into domain. They turned the straits into a highway of faith as well as commerce. Sanctuaries rose at both ends of the passage, to Poseidon at the Hellespont, to Zeus Oreos, Zeus of fair winds, at the Bosporus. Sailors stopped to pray before each crossing, pouring wine into the tide. From Asia to Europe, the gods themselves seemed to change sides. The Megarians, small though they were, became renowned as master founders. Their twin cities, Chalcedon and Byzantium, anchored the northern frontier of the Greek world. They had succeeded not by power, but by persistence. Theirs was a colonization of thresholds, where every tide could bring fortune or ruin. They learned that a city's survival depended not only on ships and swords, but on the ability to read the horizon, when to risk, when to yield, when to begin again. In time, Byzantium's towers would outshine its mothers, and empires would covet its gate. But in these first generations, it was simply another miracle of Greek endurance, a speck of marble and willpower holding the seam between continents. To the settlers who looked eastward from its walls, the Black Sea gleamed vast and uncharted. They called it the Euxine, hospitable in cautious irony. Rumour spoke of Scythians in fur, rivers that froze, and lands of endless wheat. Beyond Byzantium lay a world as rich as myth. The Greeks, being Greeks, would not let it remain rumour for long. Beyond the Bosporus, the sea darkened. Its waters were colder, deeper, more immense than any the Greeks had known. They called it the Euxine, the hospitable, though the name began as jest, a charm to disguise fear. To cross into it was to sail beyond certainty. Yet where fear lived, opportunity followed, and no city understood that truth better than Miletus. In the 7th century BC, Miletus was the queen of Ionia, 4 harbours opening to the sea, and behind them a countryside dense with olive and grain. She had outgrown her peninsula and her pride. Her merchants had already reached Egypt, Phoenicia, and the western colonies. Now they turned north. The Hellespont and Bosporus had been tamed by Megarian hands, but the Black Sea still lay waiting, a vast frontier of fish, timber, salt, and grain. To command it would be to feed half the Greek world. So the Milesians built ships fit for long distance and began their great expansion, an endeavor unmatched in the ancient world. One by one, their colonies spread along the coasts like beads on a string. The first was Sinope, founded on a twin-harboured peninsula, jutting from the southern shore around 630 BC. The site was perfection, mountains behind for defence, twin bays for fleets. Sinope became the anchor of the southern coast, the gateway to inland Anatolia. Her merchants traded with Paphlagonians and Cappadocians, exchanging pottery and cloth for metals and horses. Soon more settlements followed: Amastris, Heraclea Pontica, and Trapezus far to the east, where the mountains plunged into the sea. Across the water, on the northern rim of the Black Sea, the Milesians founded Istros, Olbia, and Pantikapaeum, cities that clung to river mouths like barnacles to a keel. The delta of the Danube became a highway of trade, leading deep into the lands of the Scythians, nomads of the steppe who came on horseback with wagons of furs and slaves, amber and gold. Between Greek trader and Scythian chieftain grew an unlikely kinship, bound by necessity and curiosity. The Scythians learned to drink wine and barter by weight. The Greeks learned to ride and to fear no horizon. By the mid-6th century, the Milesian colonies formed a network so vast that later generations would count more than 70 of them. They were not ruled from Miletus, but connected by habit, by cult, and by commerce. Together they made a civilization of shorelines, a ring around the Black Sea, each city facing inward to the others, their ships crossing in constant motion. The locals called them Milesioi, as if they were one people. Their coins bore the same symbols: lions, dolphins, the sacred griffin of Apollo. Temples rose to the same gods, and festivals celebrated the same rites. The sea that had once divided had become a common hearth. No other Greek polis matched Miletus's vision. While Corinth and Megara traded by measured routes, the Milesians pursued the unknown. Their captains learned the winds that blew from the Caucasus, the shoals of the Dniester, the taste of northern rain. They mapped currents by memory, measured distance by the flight of birds. Each voyage was a reckoning with chaos. Many never returned, lost to storms or ice. But those who survived brought back tales of rivers broad as seas and plains that fed entire nations. On the Crimean coast, their descendants built a state of their own. The Cimmerian Bosporus kingdom, a union of cities such as Pantikapaeum, Theodosia, and Nymphaeum. Founded around 480 BC, it was the first Greek realm to emerge beyond the homeland. A kingdom of merchants and monarchs who ruled not by divine descent, but by command of trade. Its kings, Greek by name, but mixed in blood, controlled the export of grain that sustained the polis of the Aegean. The Bosporan fleets, laden with wheat and salted fish, sailed each spring through the Bosporus toward Athens and the islands, their arrival a festival of relief. The colonies had become indispensable. They were no longer children of Greece, but its lifeline. Life on these distant shores demanded adaptation. Winters froze the rivers. Summers scorched the plains. The colonists learned to build with timber instead of stone, to store grain in clay pits against snow, to fight not in phalanx but on horseback beside Scythian allies. They married into local tribes, their children speaking both Greek and the guttural tongues of the north. Temples of Apollo stood beside shrines to step gods of fire and wind. Yet through all mingling, the Greeks kept their rites, the libations to the sea, the torch festivals at new moons, the hero cults for founders long dead. Their faith gave coherence to distance. Their language wove together a scattered empire of waves. Trade shaped politics. Each city owed allegiance to none, but acknowledged the bond of custom. When a harbour suffered famine, its neighbours sent grain. When pirates struck, fleets combined for revenge. The Milesian colonies were a federation without a name, a republic of sailors whose frontiers were tides. To those in the Aegean who thought of the Black Sea as the end of the earth, these men and women were proof that civilization could flourish anywhere salt touched shore. From their vantage, Miletus itself seemed both mother and myth. Many of its children never returned, but they carried her spirit everywhere. Her devotion to Apollo, her love of geometry, her appetite for discourse. In the cities of the Pontus, the Milesian dialect became the common tongue of trade and philosophy alike. When the thinkers Thales and Anaximander later looked to explain the cosmos as a vast and ordered sea, they were only giving voice to what their fellow Milesians had lived, the conviction that the world, like water, was one. Still, even in triumph, the seeds of peril were sown. The colony's prosperity attracted attention from empires older and hungrier. To the east, the Medes and then the Persians extended their power across Anatolia, drawing the Ionian cities into their shadow. Miletus itself would soon face conquest, its brilliance smothered beneath tribute and tyranny. But in the meantime, its colonies flourished in defiance of geography and fate. They had learned what no army could teach, that mastery of the sea was mastery of time. In the harbours of Olbia, as dusk fell, the wind carried two scents, the salt of the Euxine and the smoke of Greek altars. Between them stretched the story of a people who had turned exile into empire. When the priests poured wine into the tide and prayed for safe return, they did not look back to Miletus alone. They looked around the horizon to every city that bore their speech, and saw a new world, bound by oaths and memory, circling the endless sea. The Black Sea had ceased to be the edge of the Greek world. It had become its mirror. The world was growing smaller for those who dared the sea. From the pillars of Corinth to the grain-rich shores of the Black Sea, Greek ships traced bright lines of trade across every horizon. Yet there still remained one last expanse where the tides were foreign, and the gods spoke in strange voices, the far western Mediterranean. It was a sea already divided among three masters, the Greeks who sought to enter, the Etruscans who ruled its northern ports, and the Carthaginians whose fleets swept from the south. To venture there was to sail into a triangle of power, where diplomacy and danger shared the same wind. Among the Greeks, none were bolder than the Phocians of Ionia. Their city, small and walled against the restless Lydians, had no wide plain to feed it, only the sea. Its citizens were shipwrights and navigators, men who saw horizon as invitation. Their vessels were swift pentaconters, oared and sleek, able to outpace pirates and outrun storms. When Cyrus of Persia conquered Lydia around 546 BC, Phocaia's fate seemed sealed. Rather than submit, her people took to their ships, all of them. Herodotus would later say that the entire city embarked at once, leaving behind houses, temples, and graves. It was the greatest voluntary exodus in Greek memory, a migration by sea. Their destination lay west. Long before that exodus, the Phocaeans had already tested those waters. Around 600 BC, they founded Massalia, modern Marseille, on the Ligurian coast of Gaul. The site was a natural harbour, narrow-mouthed and defensible, surrounded by hills that caught the morning light. Legend told that their leader, Proteus, was welcomed by a local chieftain who offered him his daughter, Gyptis, as bride, sealing a covenant between Greek and native. From such a union grew a city destined to bridge worlds. Massalia was both fortress and marketplace. Its people, hardened by travel, ruled no empire, yet influenced all coasts. From here, their ships fanned along the Rhone, trading wine and pottery for tin, silver, and amber brought by Celtic tribes from the northern forests. Greek cups and amphorae began to appear in barbarian tombs, buried beside swords and chariots. The wine of Massalia became the blood of a new commerce. With every jar traded, the Greeks extended the habits of the Aegean into lands that had never seen olive or vine. To the south, the Phocaeans founded Emporion, modern Empúries in Catalonia, around 575 BC. Its very name meant market. There, on a peninsula kissed by two rivers, they raised warehouses and temples, living side by side with the Iberians who already farmed the plains. The colony thrived by exchange rather than conquest. Salted fish, silver, and grain flowed through its harbours toward the east. Greek textiles, ceramics, and art flowed westward in return. Emporion became a hinge between two civilizations, and through it, Greek artistry infiltrated Iberia's metalwork and architecture. Between these western outposts and the Old World stretched dangerous waters patrolled by the Carthaginians, heirs of the Phoenicians and masters of Sardinia, Corsica, and the North African coast. For years, the Greeks had skirted their domain carefully, meeting them as rivals in trade, but avoiding war. That fragile balance broke when the exiled Phocaeans sought new refuge after their flight from Asia. In 545 BCE, they founded Eulalia on the eastern shore of Corsica, carving their settlement from pine forest and volcanic stone. It was an audacious choice, close to Etruscan ports under the gaze of Carthaginian admirals. Their presence was a spark in dry grass. Within a few years, the fire came. Around 540 BC, an alliance of Carthage and Etruria gathered fleets to destroy the newcomers. The Phocaeans met them off the coast in what would later be called the Battle of Eulalia, a clash of wooden cities upon the waves. Herodotus tells that 60 Greek ships faced a combined enemy of twice their number. The sea boiled with oars and iron. Victory was ambiguous. The Greeks broke their enemy's line, but lost half their own fleet in the pursuit. It was a victory too costly to celebrate, a triumph that exiled them again. The survivors abandoned Corsica, some to return east, others to strengthen Massalia and its western colonies. Yet in defeat, they had proved something profound. The Greeks could stand against the great naval powers of the West and survive. The consequences of that battle rippled far beyond its bloodied waters. Carthage, secure in Sardinia and North Africa, tightened its grip on the Tyrrhenian Sea. The Etruscans dominated the northern coasts of Italy, their bronze mirrors and black pottery coveted by Greeks and barbarians alike. The Greeks, hemmed in, turned their gaze farther, toward Iberia and beyond the Pillars of Heracles, where the ocean began. Though few ventured so far, the idea itself mattered. The Mediterranean was no longer an Aegean lake with margins. It was a contest of equals. The Greeks had met their rivals and learned the limits of expansion and the price of endurance. Back in Massalia, the survivors of Eulalia built a city worthy of their trials. They ringed their acropolis with walls of stone, laid out quays that reached deep into the harbour, and raised temples to Artemis and Apollo, thanking the gods who had carried them from Asia to Gaul. Their colony became not just a refuge, but a capital, mother of daughters. From it sprang Nicaea, Nice, Antipolis, Antibes, and other small ports along the Riviera. Each served as a beacon for trade and Greek language among the Celtic tribes. From Massalia's docks, amphorae of wine sailed upriver toward the heart of France, following routes that would one day bear Roman legions. Civilization had outpaced empire. The Greeks of the far west lived differently from their cousins in Sicily or the Black Sea. Their cities were smaller, their neighbors foreign in face and tongue, their allies fickle, yet their resilience was unmatched. They thrived by negotiation rather than war, by curiosity rather than conquest. In the markets of Massalia, Etruscan merchants haggled beside Iberian chieftains and Phocian exiles. The din of a dozen dialects mingled with the scent of resin and fish. Every transaction was a truce renewed, every jar of wine a treaty sealed. For the first time, the Hellenic world confronted limits set not by ignorance, but by parity. The sea of three powers, Greek, Etruscan, Carthaginian, would define the Western Mediterranean for centuries. Its balance preserved trade, but stifled further colonization. The Greeks held their coasts, the Etruscans their rivers, the Carthaginians their routes to Africa and Spain. Within that triangle, peace was uneasy, but it allowed civilization to bloom. Art, science, and philosophy could travel even where armies could not. And yet, the Greeks of the West never forgot their beginning. The flight from Phocaea, the battle at Eulalia, the faith that distance could redeem defeat. Every harbour, every altar built in those lands carried the same inscription in spirit, if not in stone. Thalassa, our mother, our road, our home. By 530 BC, the Mediterranean had been mapped in Greek imagination from the Nile Delta to the Atlantic mists. Colonization was no longer an act of discovery, but of consolidation. The boundaries were drawn. What remained was to hold them. The age of exploration had become the age of endurance. South of the Aegean, where the sea turned the color of molten glass and the air smelled of papyrus and salt, another horizon beckoned. The Greeks had long traded with Egypt from afar, bartering through Phoenician intermediaries, wary of the old kingdom's pride and bureaucracy. Yet by the 7th century BC, the Nile once again welcomed foreigners. A new dynasty, the Sate Pharaohs, had restored Egypt's power, but also recognized its needs. Their armies required iron, timber, and ships. Their temples demanded sculptors and stonecutters. The Greeks possessed all three. Thus began the first sanctioned meeting between the Hellenes and the House of the Pharaohs. Pharaoh Psammetichus I, shrewd in diplomacy, opened his delta to the sea and invited Greek merchants to settle under royal protection. Around 620 BC, they founded Naucratis, a name meaning power of the ships. It was not a colony in the old sense, for the land remained Egyptian and the city stood by royal decree. Yet it was the first true Hellenic emporion on African soil, a miniature Greece nestled among lotus and reed. There, under the gaze of falcon-headed gods, the Greeks built sanctuaries to their own. Hera, Apollo, the Dioscuri, and above all to Athena, whom they identified with Egypt's Ninth. The site itself was a marvel of compromise. Egyptian officials ruled the harbour, measuring imports and taxing exports. Greek merchants lived in walled quarters, each polis maintaining its own warehouse and altar. In one quarter, the Milesians traded fine cloth and wine. In another, Aeginetans dealt in bronze. The Samians, Chians, and Cypriots joined them in a chorus of dialects. The harbour swarmed with ships of every rig, their sails striped and patched, their holds heavy with timber, olive oil, silver, and slaves. Egyptian grain, linen, and papyrus filled the outbound vessels. Every coin that changed hands, every amphora carried inland, wove Greece and Egypt a little closer together. At Naucratis, Greeks and Egyptians encountered each other not as conquerors or servants, but as equals in necessity. The Greeks marveled at Egypt's stone temples and timeless rituals. The Egyptians admired Greek skill in metalwork and shipbuilding. Priests of Sais debated with Milesian philosophers on the origins of the world. Artisans borrowed motifs across cultures. Lotus mingling with Meander, Horus beside Athena. Through this mingling, the Greeks absorbed a sense of scale and permanence unknown in their homeland. Egypt's monuments whispered of eternity, and the Greeks listened well. The architectural grandeur that would later rise on the Acropolis owed something to the shadow of the pyramids. While Naucratis thrived in the delta, another Greek adventure was unfolding westward along the Libyan coast, a tale of drought, oracles, and perseverance. Around 630 BC, the small island of Thera suffered 7 years without rain. Crops failed, wells dried, and the desperate Therians turned to Delphi for aid. The Pythia commanded them to found a city in Libya. None knew where Libya lay, but disobedience meant death by famine. After false starts and long wandering, their leader Battus, a stammering nobleman of uncertain fortune, led an expedition that at last reached a green plateau between the desert and the sea. There, upon fertile highlands, where spring water burst from the earth, they founded Cyrene. The place was astonishing, a band of temperate land, hemmed between the burning Sahara and the salt Mediterranean. Rain fell there when it fell nowhere else in Africa. The soil, fed by limestone springs, could grow anything. The Greeks saw it as a miracle, a gift of Apollo himself. Battus became king, and Cyrene his throne. Around him gathered settlers from Thera and later from the Peloponnese, each allotted land according to sacred lot. Temples rose, vineyards spread, and herds filled the pastures. In gratitude, Battus built an oracle of Apollo that rivaled Delphi, and from his reign descended the dynasty of the Batiads, kings who would rule Cyrene for 2 centuries. Cyrene's isolation bred strength. To its west stretched the desolation of the Libyan desert. To its east, Egypt's frontier. Between them, Cyrene flourished as a gate between continents. Its hills produced silphium, a fragrant plant valued above gold, medicine, spice, and myth in one. The city's coins bore its image, proof that nature itself had blessed the colony. Caravans carried silphium and wool across the sands to Egypt. In return came linen, papyrus, and art. The Greeks traded also with the Libyan tribes, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, whose horsemen roamed the plateau. Marriage, warfare, and trade intertwined until the boundaries of culture blurred. In the highlands, Greek temples stood beside Libyan shrines of rough stone. The gods had learned to share the same wind. Cyrene's kings ruled not as tyrants, but as mediators between worlds. They spoke both Greek and Libyan, presiding over councils where merchants and herders debated in the same breath. Each generation of Batiads added a city, Barca, Tochera, Oesperides, a chain of settlements stretching like beads along the coast. Together, they formed Cyrenaica, a realm of green in a continent of sand. Their wealth fed Greek artisans and philosophers alike. Their pride attracted poets. Pindar would later praise Cyrene as the shining city of chariots, a place where Apollo's light lingered even at the edge of the earth. The Greek presence in Africa was unlike any other. It was not born of flight, as in the West, nor of trade alone, as in the East. It was sanctioned by kings, tempered by diplomacy, and sustained by faith. Naucratis represented partnership, commerce under divine and royal law. Cyrene represented creation, a new polis forged from prophecy and necessity. Between them stretched the entire spectrum of Greek colonization, from merchant enclave to monarchic kingdom, from sacred oath to living myth. By the 6th century BC, the Greeks could claim harbours on every horizon. The Aegean had ceded Sicily, Italy, the Black Sea, and now the Nile and the Libyan highlands. Colonization was no longer a movement. It was a condition of being Greek. To live near salt water was to look outward, to imagine a new beginning just beyond the headland. At dusk, in Naucratis, one could see the priests of Neith lighting lamps while, across the river quarter, Greek sailors poured libations to Athena. In Cyrene, the same sun sank behind the western plateau, turning the temples rose gold, the same hue as the Silphium fields below. Two worlds bowed to the same twilight. The Greeks had come to Africa not to conquer, but to belong. For more than 2 centuries, the Greeks had lived by the sea's favor. Their cities glittered from Sicily to the Black Sea. Their ships knit the world into a web of exchange. But east of the Aegean, another tide was rising, one of empire, not adventure. From the Anatolian highlands came the Lydians, rich in gold from the Pactolus River, and behind them the Persians, who bowed to none. The old freedom of the Ionian coast, cradle of the colonizing spirit, stood in peril. When Croesus of Lydia extended his rule over Western Asia Minor around 560 BC, his reach included the Ionian cities, Miletus, Ephesus, Smyrna, and others born of the same wanderlust that had once filled the Aegean. At first, they accepted his overlordship as merchants accept taxation, unwillingly but pragmatically. Croesus, lover of Greek art and speech, treated them as tributaries rather than slaves. He built temples with their craftsmen, sent gifts to Delphi, and sought to harness their wealth rather than destroy it. Under his patronage, Ionia flourished. But empires are never still. To the east, a new power gathered, Cyrus of Persia, who swallowed Lydia and its gold in a single campaign around 546 BC. Croesus fell, his kingdom burned, and with it, the fragile balance that had preserved Ionian autonomy. When the Persians arrived, their rule was efficient but suffocating. They appointed tyrants to govern each city, men loyal not to their people, but to the great king. Tribute flowed eastward in silver and grain. Soldiers marched under banners not their own. The freedom that had once sent Greeks sailing across the world was shackled at its source. The shock of conquest rippled outward. Among the first to feel it were the Phocaeans, the seafarers who had founded Massalia and Eulalia. Faced with Persian domination, they chose exile over submission. In an act of defiance as audacious as any in Greek memory, the entire population took to their ships, abandoning their city to the invaders. Laden with families and icons, they sailed west, some to Corsica, some to Massalia, carrying with them the last embers of Ionian independence. Their flight became legend, a people transforming defeat into migration, turning loss into continuity. Colonization, once a sign of growth, had become an act of survival. Back in Ionia, the remaining cities endured under Persian oversight, their harbours policed, their councils silenced. Yet beneath the outward calm, resentment smouldered. The memory of liberty was not easily erased. The philosopher Heraclitus of Ephesus would later write, "War is the father of all things." And in those years, the saying proved prophecy. Miletus, the proudest of the Ionian cities, grew restless under its appointed tyrant, Histiaeus, and his deputy Aristagoras. Both men were clever, ambitious, and doomed. The spark came from afar. In 499 BC, Aristagoras, seeking Persian favor, led an expedition to conquer Naxos on behalf of the satrap of Lydia. The attack failed, debts mounted, Persian wrath loomed. To save himself, Aristagoras did the unthinkable. He cast off his Persian allegiance and declared his city free. Miletus rebelled, and with it, all of Ionia. The flames of revolt leapt from city to city, consuming tyrants, igniting councils, summoning fleets. It was not merely a political uprising. It was a memory reborn. The same courage that had once sent the Greeks west now turned east, against empire itself. For a moment, victory seemed possible. The Ionians appealed to mainland Greece, and Athens, itself newly liberated from tyranny, sent ships in solidarity. Together, they struck inland, storming Sardis, the old Lydian capital, and setting it ablaze. The Persians were stunned, their satraps fled, the Greeks rejoiced. But triumph is brittle when built on distance. Soon, Persian discipline reasserted itself. From beyond the mountains came armies in endless ranks, their arrows darkening the sun. The rebellion faltered city by city. The Persians burned Ephesus, enslaved Clazomene, besieged Priene. Yet the Ionians would not yield. Their last stand came by sea. In 494 BC, off the island of Lade, the combined Greek fleets met the Persians in one of the greatest naval battles of the age. More than 300 ships formed the Ionian line, their decks crowded with free citizens, not mercenaries. Facing them were the Persian squadrons, crewed by Phoenicians and Egyptians, disciplined and deadly. At first, the Greeks fought with the fury of desperation, driving their rams into enemy hulls. But division, the oldest Greek curse, undid them. The Samians, doubting victory, withdrew. Panic spread. The line shattered. The Persians pressed the advantage, surrounding and annihilating the rest. The sea turned black with burning timber and men. The Battle of Lade ended the Ionian revolt, and with it, the dream of an independent East. The punishment was merciless. Miletus, heart of the rebellion and mother of colonies, was stormed and destroyed. Its people were slaughtered or led away into captivity, its temples leveled, its harbour filled with ash. In Athens, when the tragedy, the fall of Miletus, was later performed, the audience wept so bitterly that the playwright was fined for reminding them of their shame. The ruin of Miletus marked the end of an age. The fountainhead of colonization turned to dust. Yet even in destruction, Ionia's influence endured. The exiles of Miletus scattered across the seas, carrying their knowledge, their art, their grief. Some fled west to their colonies in the Black Sea and Italy, others north to Thrace or the islands. Wherever they went, they spoke of lost freedom and vowed its return. Their dispersal reanimated the old impulse to found anew, a diaspora born not of ambition, but of necessity. The same sea that had carried their ancestors outward now received them again, not as masters, but as refugees. Meanwhile, Persia absorbed the coast, incorporating it into its satrapies. Tribute replaced independence, but the conquerors also inherited what they had crushed, a network of cities, harbours, and trade routes that made the empire richer, Ironically, the Persians became unwilling stewards of Greek expansion, preserving the infrastructure that had once made Ionia great. For the Greeks who watched from afar, the lesson was bitter and clear. Colonization had given them reach. Unity alone could give them survival. The fall of Miletus was no longer just a local tragedy. It was a warning that the age of small, free cities was passing. The winds of empire now touched every shore. Soon, the mainland itself would feel them. But the Greek story was never one of submission. From the ashes of Miletus and the humiliation of Lade would rise a determination fierce enough to challenge the world. The colonists who had built their cities across 3 seas had taught Greece the habits of expansion, and those habits would now serve in war. The horizon that had once promised trade now promised vengeance. The ruin of Miletus had taught the Greeks that freedom could not survive in fragments. Out of its ashes rose a new kind of colonization, no longer the work of exiles or merchants, but of states and strategoi. The classical age turned the restless habit of founding into an instrument of policy. Expansion, once born of hunger and curiosity, became the measure of empire itself. At the center of this transformation stood Athens. Victorious at Salamis, rebuilt after Persian fire, the city discovered that the sea could be governed as a realm. Its fleet, 200 triremes strong, was more than defense. It was dominion. Through the Delian League, Athens gathered her allies under the pretext of common cause, exacting tribute from islands that had once been equals. To secure that web, she sent out settlers, clerics, citizens granted land abroad but bound to her by law. Unlike the old oikists, these settlements did not sever ties with home. Their inhabitants remained Athenians, soldiers as much as farmers, anchors of empire scattered across the Aegean. On Euboea, on Lesbos, in the Hellespont, they held strategic ground and watched the grain routes from the Black Sea. The sacred fire they carried was no longer symbol of independence, but of allegiance. Athens had remade colonization into garrison and guarantee, yet not all expansion flowed from compulsion. Across the Ionian horizon, the dream of cooperation still flickered. When peace returned after the Persian Wars, the oracles of Greece murmured of a new foundation, one that would heal divisions rather than exploit them. From that vision came Thurii, the so-called Pan-Hellenic city, planted in 444 BC on the ruins of fallen Sybaris in southern Italy. Its founders, guided by Pericles and advised by the historian Herodotus, summoned colonists from every corner of the Greek world. Dorian and Ionian, islander and mainlander, they built together a city dedicated not to one polis, but to all. The experiment was dazzling and fragile. Thuri's streets were laid in perfect grid, its laws inscribed by the sophist Charondas, its temples shared by gods of rival dialects. For a moment, it seemed the Hellenic peoples had learned to live as one, but unity, like freedom, was a delicate guest. Old jealousies soon returned, Athenians against Peloponnesians, nobles against traders. Still, the idea remained that the Greek world could act in concert, could found cities not for survival, but for civilization itself. Elsewhere, power took rougher forms. In Sicily, victory over Carthage had ushered in a century of tyrants whose ambition outshone their virtue. Gelon of Syracuse, Hieron, and later Dionysius I turned colonization into empire, resettling cities, deporting populations, building fleets larger than those of Athens herself. Dionysius filled the western seas with new foundations, Adrianon, Tyndaris, Tauromenion, each both fortress and frontier. He fortified Syracuse with walls 10 miles long, and declared himself the shield of Greek liberty against Carthage. In his shadow, Sicily became less a constellation of polies than a single blazing star. Yet tyranny could not quench the colonizing spirit. It only redirected it. Greek soldiers, released from Dionysius's service, spread his methods across the Adriatic and into Epirus. The very instruments of oppression, surveyed land, planned streets, walls of cut stone, would become the hallmarks of later Hellenistic city building. The Greeks had learned to replicate not only themselves, but their order. Meanwhile, Athens sought to reclaim the West by diplomacy and myth. When Euripides staged Ion, celebrating Apollo's son as founder of a pan-Athenian race, he was voicing a new creed, that wherever Greek cities stood, they were extensions of Attic destiny. Even failed colonies could be rewritten as triumphs of culture. Sculpture, drama, philosophy, these became forms of colonization subtler than ships and walls. The Athenian mind reached farther than her navy ever could. But time was changing the sea. Sparta's brief hegemony after the Peloponnesian War brought no new foundations, only garrisons, grim and joyless. The energy that had once filled the Aegean shifted west again, towards Sicily and Italy, where freedom might still be reborn. Into this exhausted landscape, in 344 BC, came a man whose name carried both exile and redemption, Timoleon of Corinth. Timoleon had lived half a life in disgrace, having slain his own brother to save his city from tyranny. When Syracuse, torn by civil war and besieged by Carthage, called for aid, Corinth chose him to lead the expedition. He crossed the sea not as conqueror, but as deliverer, bringing with him only a few thousand volunteers. Yet his arrival changed everything. Landing in Sicily, he found ruins where cities had once stood, their people scattered by decades of war. With patience and persuasion, he restored them, rebuilding walls, reviving assemblies, summoning settlers from Greece and Italy alike. Over 7 years, he brought 60,000 new colonists to the island, refounding not only Syracuse, but Akragas, Gela, and Hymera. Fields long deserted bloomed again, temples reopened. The sound of hammer and lyre returned. This Timolean restoration was colonization reborn in moral form. No tyrant's decree compelled it, no famine drove it. It was an act of renewal, of faith in civic life itself. To the exiles who answered his call, Sicily seemed a second chance not only for themselves, but for Greece entire, a realm where law might outlast ambition. When Timoleon, grown blind, laid down his power and died, the people buried him in the agora and inscribed upon his tomb. He freed Sicily, he repopulated her cities, he restored her laws. In his life, the Greeks glimpsed what their colonizing genius had always sought, the recreation of order after chaos, of home after wandering. By the end of the 4th century, the pattern was complete. The sea that had once carried refugees now bore fleets of organized states. Colonization had matured into governance, rebirth into policy. Athens had scattered her clerics across the islands. Corinth had redeemed Sicily. Even the shattered Ionian cities stirred again under Persian tolerance. What began as survival had become strategy, and strategy art. But a greater transformation was coming. In the north, a new power was gathering, one that would weld together the scattered energies of Greece into a single spear point. Macedon, under Philip II and his son Alexander, would turn the colonists' dream into the conqueror's design. The city founded by the oikists would soon yield to the city founded by the king. Still, before empire, there was always exile, and before the conqueror, the settler. The Greeks had spent centuries learning how to build anew upon alien soil. When the Macedonians marched east, they carried not only their spears, but that ancient skill, the gift of making the foreign familiar. When the trumpet of empire replaced the oar's rhythm, the Greek world changed its scale. The art of founding cities, once the labor of fishermen, exiles, and dreamers, passed into the hands of kings. The Macedonian conquest turned colonization from a wandering impulse into a machinery of rule, scattering Greek cities across continents where no Greek had ever stood. The age of the oikists ended. The age of the strategos began. At its head stood Alexander, son of Philip II, born in the shadow of the northern mountains, yet educated among philosophers. His tutor Aristotle had taught him that the world was one vast organism awaiting order. Conquest, in Alexander's vision, was not destruction, but arrangement, a kind of divine urban planning on the scale of continents. When he crossed into Asia in 334 BC, he carried not only an army, but an idea that Greek life, with its markets, temples, and theatres, could bloom wherever he set his seal. His first foundations followed victory like footprints in sand. At the mouth of the Nile, after defeating the Persian satraps, he marked out a site where river met sea and the desert bent toward the Mediterranean. There, guided by omens of birds and the compass of his own ambition, he traced the boundaries of Alexandria in 331 BC. Its plan was geometric, its streets broad and straight, its harbour double like a lion's jaw. Greek architects measured and plotted. Egyptian labourers raised the walls. Merchants from every land filled the markets. Within a generation, it became the greatest port in the world, a city where Greek reason and Egyptian grandeur fused into one. Alexandria was model and message. As the conqueror marched east, across the Euphrates, through Babylon, to the Hindu Kush, he scattered more of its kind. Alexandria by the Aracosians, Alexandria in Arachosia, Alexandria Escate, the farthest. Some were no more than fortified camps. Others blossomed into cities that would outlast empires. Each bore the same grid, the same agora, the same sense of measured order imposed on wilderness. Where the earlier Greeks had founded for freedom, Alexander founded for unity. The world itself was to be his polis. His death in 323 BC broke the body of his empire, but not its vision. The generals who carved up his domains, the Diaduchi, successors, continued to build in his image, each ruler a new oikistes with armies instead of settlers. Seleucus, inheriting the vast eastern lands, planted cities like seeds across the Syrian plains and Mesopotamian rivers. Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, Apamea, Laodicea. Each bore his dynasty's stamp, each a fortress and marketplace entwined. The Antigonids in Macedon and Lysimachus in Thrace followed suit, founding Antigonea and Lysimachia along the coasts, where roads met rivers and garrisons could guard trade. Colonization had become a grammar of power, each city a line in the syntax of empire. These Hellenistic foundations shared a recognizable form. Streets intersected at right angles. Public spaces were deliberate and central. Temples honored both Greek gods and local deities. In Antioch, Zeus shared his precinct with the Syrian Hadad. In Seleucia, Mesopotamian river gods watched over harbors lined with Greek stowers. The settlers themselves were hybrids. Macedonian veterans granted land as kleroushoi. Greek artisans, mercenaries, traders, and administrators. Each city was a microcosm of empire, a frontier garrison and cultural laboratory at once. From the Mediterranean to the Indus, this new web of cities carried Greek speech, law, and architecture into regions that had never known them. Markets rang with words from a dozen dialects. Coins bore Greek legends beside Persian symbols. The polis had become portable, adaptable, infinite. Where once a colony had sought independence from its metropolis, these cities existed to mirror their king's glory. Founding was no longer rebellion, but representation. Yet even under royal command, the old spirit endured. Many of these settlements began as military outposts, but evolved into living communities, their citizens governing themselves in assemblies, debating in theatres, and erecting statues to both Alexander and local heroes. The descendants of Macedonian soldiers married women from Egypt, Syria, and Bactria. Their children spoke Greek in markets and native tongues at home. From such unions arose a new people, the Hellenistic Greeks, heirs to two worlds. No city embodied this synthesis better than Alexandria itself. Its library gathered the wisdom of the world, texts from Babylon, Egypt, and Athens, while its museum trained scholars whose discoveries would echo for millennia. Its lighthouse, the Pharos, shone across the Mediterranean like an artificial sun. Here was the ultimate metamorphosis of colonization. Knowledge as dominion, learning as legacy. The city that Alexander had imagined as a crossroads became the brain of the Hellenistic world. Beyond the imperial capitals, Greek foundations reached the edges of imagination. In Bactria, far from the sea, settlers carved cities into mountain valleys, blending Greek theatre with Buddhist stupa. In Iconium, on the Oxus River, a gymnasium stood beside Eastern temples, a dialogue in marble between Athens and Asia. Colonization had ceased to be confined by water. It had become continental. The sea was no longer boundary, but memory. Still, empires are mortal, even when their cities endure. By the 2nd century BC, the successors' kingdoms had begun to fracture under their own weight. New powers, the Romans in the west, the Parthians in the east, pressed upon the Hellenistic borders. The founding frenzy slowed. Many Greek cities became prizes in foreign hands, their independence ceremonial. Their founders long turned to dust, but their pattern persisted. Wherever a Greek had once built an agora, civilization followed. Even Rome, conqueror of the Greeks, adopted their grid, their laws, their gods translated into Latin. Colonization had achieved what conquest never could. It had made the world Greek in form, if not in name. By the time Alexandria's library sent its last scroll into smoke, the journey begun on the Aegean's rocky shores had circled the earth. From Naxos to the Hindu Kush, from Syracuse to Cyrene, from Massalia to the Nile, the same geometry of thought and stone repeated itself, square, ordered, enduring. The Greeks had set out to find space. They had found continuity. What began as the voyage of sailors became the architecture of empire. And yet, beneath the weight of empires, the spirit that had kindled those first sails never vanished. In every Greek city, ancient or new, burned a hearth sacred to Hestia, goddess of home and fire. The flame carried by the earliest colonists from their mother cities still flickered, whether in a Sicilian temple or a Syrian marketplace. It was a promise made to the sea that even far from home, the Greeks would remain themselves. The colonization of the world had ended, but its idea had not. Wherever men built in straight lines and measured beauty, wherever thought sought harmony between reason and land, the ghost of the old oikists walked beside them. The Greeks had not conquered the earth. They had taught it how to imagine itself,